Constitution Day to everyone, Nepali Constitution Day, and then thanks for being here in spite of the holidays up here. So this is the 23rd series of the Nepal Mental Health Research webinar, and then we're just talking about how long we have been doing this. So thank you all for being a part of this webinar up in here. So just to talk very briefly about our webinar, it's a series of a webinar where we bring people from all around the world to talk about mental health and then behavioral health, and then it's focused on early career researchers in Nepal. So we've been running this through TPO Nepal and then the Center for Global Mental Health Equity at the George Washington University. Very quickly, my introduction, I'm Sahad Rai. I work as a research scientist at the George Washington University, and also I'm affiliated with TPO Nepal. So today we have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Kelly Rose Clark, whom I won't be introducing, but later Dr. Brandon Code will be introducing. And then our topic for today is psychological intervention for adolescents in Nepal, asking what works for whom, how, and in what circumstances of here. So before going to the core of the webinar, I just wanted to run quickly through some of the housekeepings up here. So just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. I hope it is right, Ritika. I don't see the prompt, but I hope it's getting recorded. So just heads up to all of you attending, it's being recorded. It's going to be an hour long. So we have 15 minutes for speaker, and then for 10 to 15 minutes, we'll be doing Q&A sessions, and then we'll be going into a breakout room. And then finally, we'll come back and then have another form of discussion. So we hope we can do all of this within an hour time. And then for Kelly and then other breakout group facilitators, Ritika and me are going to give you a prompt about times and everything up in there. So you're requested to stay mute throughout the session, especially when Kelly is presenting. And then after that, you'll have a chance to ask your questions. But if you want to put up your questions in the chat box, you're free to do that as well. And we'll try to cover all of your questions as much as possible. But if we can't do that, I hope if Kelly is okay, and also Suzanne, who is also a part of this, you can send your questions to them and then they will answer. I hope that's okay. Like, I didn't ask your permission, but I hope that's okay for you up there. And the last thing is on the feedback form. So in between the session and in the end of the session, Ritika will be sending a feedback form in the chat box. So that's something very important to us, to give your comments and everything. So please feel free to fill up the feedback form up in there. And then on the future events, this is something we run every third week of every month, and that's the English month up in there. So we run it almost every month, except some exceptions, which I'll be talking in the third point up there. So to get the notifications of the webinar, we will be sending you an invitation email for those who are in the listserv. And then also we do advertise all these events through our Twitter, through our Facebook and Instagram pages. So if you haven't liked, subscribed, or whatever we call it in this terms, please do that so that you will get notified of all of these things. And the recording of this webinar will also be available through our social media sites as well. So the next week and the other is Dasai and Tihar, October and November. So we will be taking a break. So we will be seeing you after 3 months, right? After this webinar up there. So I won't take a lot of time. I hope I covered everything up in there. So I would like to ask Brandon to introduce our speaker for today. Yeah, so over to you, Brandon.
Thank you so much. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rose Clark. So Kelly Rose Clark is a senior lecturer in global mental health and an UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at King's College London. She's a social scientist interested in developing and evaluating child and adolescent mental health interventions in low and middle income countries such as Nepal. She began working in Nepal about 13 years ago, it looks like, So in 2010, when she was doing her PhD on maternal mental health, currently, she is working with TPO Nepal to develop and test the feasibility of a sports-based mental health promotion intervention in Bardia, and also evaluating interpersonal therapy in a trial for adolescents with depression in Chitwan. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rose Clark, and I'll turn it over to you.
So I'll stop sharing my screen and let you take over.
Okay. So really, after so long in Nepali, I should be able to give this presentation in Nepali, shouldn't I? But Sauharda, since you were my Nepali teacher, I'm blaming you. Thanks everyone. Thanks Brandon for the introduction. Thanks Ritika, Benita for making sure that I'm on time and ready to present, and for the invitation. I want to talk to you about our project in Chitwan today. And I'm going to talk about about SATI, our program, and I'm talking on behalf of our magnificent team, the SATI team, who are all here, some perhaps hiding on the list of participants, I hope, for this webinar. To mention a few TPO colleagues, Indira Pradhan, Pragya Shesta, Sujan, who I'm hoping is going to interact with some of you later, and Nagendra, who I think you all know well, Kamal Gautam. So we're a strong team, and we're working on an intervention called interpersonal therapy. Interpersonal therapy is talking therapy. It's delivered over 10 sessions, and there are 2 pre-group sessions. So in those 2 pre-group sessions, the adolescent initially meets with a facilitator and talks about their life, their problems, their depression. And then they meet with the facilitator again, but also this time with the parent. They then meet as part of a group of 6 to 8 adolescents. And they work through various talking therapy, interpersonal therapy strategies, techniques, and terminate after the 9th, 10th session. So this is the overview of the intervention we've been working on, and this is something that has been recommended by the World Health Organization. A little bit more detail about IPT, which I hope will help for the discussions later. So IPT, interpersonal therapy, focuses on 4 particular problem areas. So we think about dispute, arguments. We think about grief, so bereavement, loneliness, and role transition. And the IPT experts, master trainers, their philosophy is that most depression can be triggered by one of these 4 problem areas. And IPT has strategies related to each of these problem areas. So for example, if you have an adolescent who is having a dispute, so for example, an argument with their peers, an argument with their parents, that's often the most common problem we encounter, then the idea is to get them to understand where the dispute is. Are they at loggerheads, so to speak, or is there is it something that can be resolved? So trying to understand where they are in the story of that dispute, and also giving them ways in which they can try to empathize, or at least help to understand the other person's perspective. Just a couple of the strategies, there are several. Then grief. So within IPT, the aim is not to take away the grief, as it says here, but to make the person stronger to carry the grief. And one of the really useful strategies in this problem area is about encouraging the adolescent to have time to mourn. So to accept that and to give it some structure and some boundaries so that they can continue with the rest of their lives. The area loneliness. So it might seem unlikely that that adolescents who are in school all day with their peers and go home when they are in these big extended family homes could be lonely, but often the loneliness is emotional loneliness. They have no one to talk to about their problems. Some of them may have difficulties making friends. And so there are strategies within IPT to help them overcome those barriers to developing their interpersonal relationships, and for them to think about opportunities in their lives where they might be able to overcome loneliness. And finally, role transition. This is more common than you might imagine. So role transitions could be something like moving from one area to another, could be getting married or having children. It could also be moving schools, or perhaps in some cases, a parent migrating abroad and an adolescent having to take on new responsibilities. And so within IPT, we talk about mourning the old role, but we also then encourage the adolescent to think about the pros and the cons, the positives and negatives of their new role. So just a very quick tour of what you might expect in IPT. Alongside the strategies, there are some umbrella techniques used regardless of your problem area. So in each session, adolescents check in on their mood and their symptoms. So they follow their own progress in terms of their depressive symptoms as the intervention goes on. And in that way, it helps them to be able to link their mood to things that are happening in their everyday life, whether that's particular events or arguments. Why are they feeling like they have, and why has their depression gone up or down? And we do a lot of work on communication analysis. So getting them to try to take another person's perspective, imagine that they're in that person's shoes, then thinking about ways in which they can have conversations at a good time. So striking while the iron is cold, to try and optimize the context in which they might be having some difficult conversations or difficult communication. Decision analysis. So this is about really akin to problem solving. So they're thinking about different options, different potential solutions, and trying to decide which one would be best. Role play, practicing difficult communication or difficult discussions with other members of the group. And then everyone has homework, but we don't call it homework, of course, we call it experiments. And so we agree on this work at home, and then they come back and report in the group about what they've been doing. So IPT has been used all over the world. It was developed initially in the US, but since then has been used all over the place, including in some low and middle income countries that I've shown there on the map, and that's by no means exhaustive. Interpersonal therapy for adolescents has been tested in Uganda and South Africa, and hopefully soon in Nepal. So SARTI-1, the first of our projects focusing on interpersonal therapy. So myself and colleagues from TPO, including Indira and Pragya, I'm not sure if they've joined yet, but I hope so they can correct me. We worked to adapt and test interpersonal therapy in Sindhupalchok. That was in sort of between 2018 and 2020. And we adapted IPT for government secondary schools. So the policy One Nurse, One School, we decided to take advantage of that, or what that might become, and to see if we could train school nurses to deliver IPT in schools. And given the nurses were all women, we also wanted to train some male facilitators. So we recruited some local male workers. And they were all near peers, so to speak, so aged between 18 and 24. And we delivered IPT in single-sex groups, so girls groups and boys groups. And the facilitators worked in pairs to deliver that. We tested IPT in a feasibility study without a control arm. So these results look rather inflated. They look too impressive, really. And the sample size was also very small. I think it was of 64. So very, very small study, just a proof of concept study. But what we did see was some really promising improvements in depression and also anxiety and PTSD symptoms across all of our outcomes. Another interesting thing we found was, much to our surprise, that the boys seemed to be improving more than the girls, which is contrary to what a trial in Uganda had found. They had found that girls benefited from IPT and boys didn't. So a very small, very uncontrolled study, but some interesting and promising results. So this got us thinking a little bit more about where we might go next with this intervention that we'd adapted and tested in Sindapalchok. And this really hints at a bigger picture in talking therapies, where we are in Nepal, but also more globally, in a sense of, we know that by and large, talking therapies can be beneficial, but they're not always beneficial, and not for everyone, and not in every setting. So for example, in Uganda, not seeing benefits for boys, but girls. In South Africa, a trial with adults, the dropout rate was incredibly high. More than half of the participants didn't attend a single session, and those that did seemed to benefit. So some really interesting questions around individual characteristics and contexts that seem to influence whether or not interpersonal therapy works, and talking therapies in general. And what we haven't seen much in the way of development or advancement or optimization of talking therapies, despite the increasing evidence for their benefit. And our thinking is that it would be really cool to be a bit clever, a bit smarter about the way that we use talking therapies. For example, being able to predict what kind of talking therapy might work, and what kinds of strategies and what kinds of people are more likely to benefit from it, so that we can have a more informed discussion about what will work where, and we can generate some middle range theory for policymakers to be able to think about what's an appropriate intervention in their context. And so as a result of this came SATI 2. And this is what we're working on now. This started just last year ago. And what we want to do with SATI 2 is still focused on interpersonal therapy, but taking on board some of those bigger questions. So we're planning to test interpersonal therapy in Nepal, in Chitwan this time. So we're making things a bit easier for us by working in Chitwan rather than Sindapalchok. Does it work at a population level? So we want to know that. But we also want to know how it works. What is in that black box of interpersonal therapy that means that adolescent depression improves? We want to know who benefits most and why. We want to know where IPT works best in relation to the community. What are the characteristics of the community? What are the characteristics of the school environment that predict the outcomes of IPT or moderate the effects of IPT? And finally, we want to think about what happens beyond the usual follow-up time of 6 months. We want to know what happens in the long term, and not just for mental health outcomes, but thinking about functional outcomes, economic outcomes, outcomes for adolescents' families, for their peers. So a really in-depth look at what IPT is doing in the context of Chitwan. And to do this, we've selected an approach called a realist cluster randomized control trial. So this is, or has been described as a randomized control trial with a glorified process evaluation, but it's a little bit more than that. It has the traditional design of a randomized control trial. So you have two arms, you have schools randomized from one arm to the other. But the whole premise of the study is that you are testing a priori hypotheses about particular mechanisms through which IPT works, as well as moderators. And to do that, we need a good sense of what these hypotheses are going to be. So one of the cornerstones of a realist cluster randomized control trial is something called context mechanism outcome hypotheses, or CMOs, as they call it in the club. And CMOs are essentially hypotheses that link context, mechanism, and outcome together. And you test these through so you power your trial to test these specific CMO hypotheses. So they're about how intervention mechanisms interact with context differentially to produce outcomes. So some examples we had before we really got thinking about our trial and our context. So one example here, adolescents participating in IPT with a family history of mental ill health are less likely to be able to resolve their interpersonal problems and will therefore not be able to reduce interpersonal stress to the same extent, hence smaller reductions in depression. So here the context is living in a family with a parent who has a history of mental ill health in a context where they cannot access care. Your mechanism is about resolving interpersonal stress. So to improve your outcome, so reduce your depression, you need to reduce your interpersonal stress, and you can't do that in that particular context. So I hope that makes sense. After discussions, I hope it makes a bit more sense. And in a realist cluster randomized control trial, you start with a theory of change. Of course, always start with a theory of change, especially if you work with Nagendra Lewtel. And from that, you extract your CMO hypotheses. And these are also informed by formative research, by literature reviews, by discussions with stakeholders and other experts. And then testing these, so exploring these hypotheses more through collection of qualitative data, so asking more about the particular CMO hypotheses through focus group discussions and interviews with participants during the trial. And then the next stage is to use your trial data to test those refined CMO hypotheses, and then use that to refine your theory of change, and to verify your mid-range theory, which is the useful stuff that will come out hopefully at the end of our program. So very quickly, and this is very oversimplified, believe me, this is our logic model, our starting point for a logic model of how interpersonal therapy might work in Nepal. And I should say this is group interpersonal therapy. So we have both the interpersonal IPT specific mechanisms, but we also have to consider what are the mechanisms that might be there, that might be unique to a group talking therapy. What is it about a group context that helps to decrease adolescents' depression? So we can think about the individual moderators, we can think about the therapeutic moderators, and we can think about particular aspects of context that influence the way in which IPT is working. But as a very simplistic overview, the idea that if adolescents participate in IPT, they learn to process their emotions, they may be able to resolve their interpersonal problems and improve their interpersonal situation, which means that they have increased support, decreased stress, and those together lead, very simplistically, to decreased depression. So at that stage, perhaps it's time to talk to you all about your thoughts about how a talking therapy could be working in Nepal. So Hada, shall I pass back to you?
Thanks. Thank you, Kelly. This is wonderful. Yes, wonderful. So before we go into the discussion session, we'll just have some time for Q&A. We already received some questions up in the chat box up well, so maybe we can start from there, and then for others who have their questions, then feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. So Kelly, I think you can see the chat up there. So Ashley has a question on like what are the theoretical and mechanistic differences between IPT and problem solving therapy. Yeah, so maybe we can start with that question and then move on to like others.
So to take Ashley's question, I don't know very much about problem-solving therapy, and I should certainly put my hands up and say I'm not a psychologist, and I actually don't deliver this therapy. That's for experts like Indira and Pragya and Parvati and Pratima. What I do know is that IPT doesn't really have a theoretical background, that it was more developed out of a need than a theory, but it has theoretical links to attachment theory. The mechanistic differences between IPT and problem-solving therapy. I think there's a huge amount of overlap in terms of the generation of solutions, of potential problem-solving approaches. But I think that IPT, in my understanding, starts from the premise that stress is generated through interpersonal difficulty rather than problems per se. It's a terrible answer to your question, Ashley, and I think I should have stopped at the stage where I said that I didn't know very much about problem-solving therapy. Is realist the same as pragmatic trials? No, I don't think so. Again, I don't know much about pragmatic trials, but realist is very much more focused on understanding context mechanisms and outcomes. So it's realist evaluation with, well, actually, I should say it's a cluster randomized control trial with a dollop of realist evaluation on top.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so other questions from the audience? Brandon, I see here, but I think that's more of a comment than a question. So yeah, I'll just leave it up there. But any other questions from the audience?
I like these comments rather than questions.
View of Dai has a question up there.
Sure.
Yeah, so would you be able to reset the logic model in the presentation mode? Yep, there you
go. Sorry, let me just put it into a presentation. So this is actually based on a paper about hypothesized causal pathways by Lipsitz and Markovits, which has been, we've just added here the individual moderators, contextual moderators, and therapeutic moderators. Actually, the theory of change that we are working from doesn't look like this. It is based on secondary analysis of qualitative data from our feasibility study in Sindhapalchok, from a review of the global literature on mediators, moderators, and predictors of interpersonal therapy for adolescents, and some theory of change workshops that we've done with IPT practitioners from across the globe. So you can imagine that it doesn't look anywhere near as neat and tidy and cohesive as this one here, but I think for the sake of simplicity and to bring us all on the same page as this one is quite useful.
Thanks, Kelly. Any other questions? Comments? There you go, Kelly. So View of That has a question up there.
Okay. my main question is, if you think it's feasible, useful to understand the explanatory models that the adolescents have about what is driving their depression, and if they point to the 4 primary targets of IPT, then maybe that predicts response. Yeah, I fully agree. I think it is useful. We published a paper. It's always nice to plug one of your own papers. We published a paper on interpersonal, an interpersonal model of adolescent depression in Nepal, which was published in Social Science and Medicine. And that essentially looked at, we had qualitative data looking at adolescents' experiences of depression, and then looking at the extent to which they overlapped with an interpersonal model of depression. And we saw a fair amount of overlap, particularly in relation to disputes, that the problems that were being tackled, the pertinent interpersonal problems that were being tackled in interpersonal therapy were very relevant to the adolescents in Sindhupalchok.
And Kelly, Ashley has more question on the group selections and all.
Are the groups made of particular selected groups? How are you thinking about that composition? Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And certainly there's something very interesting there about composition in relation to how IPT works. When you have a very cohesive group, I can see Manasvi hiding somewhere down there in the seminar participants, but thinking about group cohesion and how that relates to outcome, or how that might predict outcome. So in terms of composition, we have single sex groups, and that was, we asked adolescents what they would prefer. In terms of composition, we have to think about the logistics of when to run the sessions. So making sure that we have enough overlap in terms of school timetables. So we found it easier to work within, or to have groups comprised of 1 year group within a school. Other than that, we haven't been thinking about composition beyond, of course, eligibility criteria. So depression symptoms, functional difficulties. But I think that's something that we'll probably explore through group cohesion measures. Thank you very much, Manasvi. And qualitative research in our trial.
Thanks, Kelly. I'll say the last question for myself up here, just to follow up on the composition. Kelly, can you talk a little bit about who is going to deliver this? You mentioned that it's going to be, it was like school nurses or someone who is doing this in Sindhupalchok, but is it going to be the same in Chitwan up in there? So, or is it going to be some peer who's going to do this?
Yeah, as I'm sure you all know far better than me, the rollout of the school nurse policy has been, let's say, not entire, not fully rolled out, and its future is a little bit uncertain. So for now, the school nurses that are in post, it's unclear how long their contracts will last for. So whilst in the area in Chitwan we're working in, there are school nurses, we're not entirely sure how long they'll be around for, whether they'll be around for the duration of the program. We also don't know at the moment what their schedule looks like. So some of them I know are being called in to do supply teaching when other teachers are absent. So before we engaged with them as IPT facilitators in the trial, we wanted to know a little bit more about the feasibility of doing so. So we've taken a bit of a step back. We've recruited local lay facilitators. So they're all doing their bachelor's at the moment, the same age group as in Sindhupalchok, under 24, I think. And in the meantime, we're going to do some qualitative work with the school nurses to understand their appetite for doing this kind of work, and also to think about the sustainability of doing that going forwards.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, one of the things that we've been trying to explore was about like in terms of outcome measures for someone who is delivering the care, like what does it means for someone who is delivering the care, and then if the sense of like helping others is also improve their outcomes as well. So we can talk more about it, Kelly, but since I'm a facilitator, I don't want to take a lot of the time, and Ritika has already signaled that it's time to move on to the breakout session. So we'll do that. I think everything is ready, right? What we will be doing is we will be dividing ourselves into 2, 3, 4, Ritika? Three. All right, thanks. 3 breakout room, and then we'll be having a facilitator among us. And then these are 2 questions that we'll be discussing. Ritika, can you give more clarity on who is going to do what?
Absolutely. Let me jump in. So we have 3 breakout rooms, and every breakout room will discuss one question that has already been pre-assigned to the team. Kelly's group is going to discuss question 2. Sauharda and Sujan's groups are going to discuss question 1. The breakout room will last for roughly 12 minutes, after which you will be prompted to return back to the main room, where we will basically summarize the discussion. And Kelly has a bunch of other slides in which she will provide her insights on the discussions as well. One thing, because Kelly is an English speaker, but I know that a lot of our participants might not be that fluent in English, I've tried to group the breakout rooms in a way that English speakers are grouped in one with Kelly, and Sauharda and Sujan get more Nepali speaking people. I might not have 100% accuracy. So if there is anybody in a group that is not comfortable with the language, please feel free to come back to the main session. I will reassign you accordingly. Each breakout room has roughly 11 people. So enjoy your sessions. At the end of 12 minutes, you will get a prompt that you only have 30 seconds left for the discussions. Are we good?
All right, see you in the breakout room.
Opening the rooms and happy discussing.
Ritika, सबैजना आइसक्नुभएको? Yes, right. So yeah, I'm just looking at the time, and it looks like we have very little time right now. So हामीसँग 3 जना ग्रुपहरू हुनुहुन्थ्यो. Maybe group 1 ले सानो 1 minute-मा 1 minute or less than 1 minute-मा तपाईहरुको summary भनिदिनुस् न what you all discussed. And I'm not sure group 1 मा को हुनुहुन्थ्यो, Ritika. So if
Maybe Sujan can go first, and then Sauharda, and then Kelly ले चाहिँ आफ्नो discuss गर्दै round गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ.
that's perfect. हजुर.
Thank you. So we had around, I think, 10 members in our group. And we had a very interesting, I should say, discussion. So the question was, what kind of adolescent will benefit most? A list from IPT and why? First of all, we started with the literature, with the study from Sindhu Palchuk, which showed that the boys benefited more than the girls, and some of the participants were quite intrigued about the result, because it's more expected that there is more gender violence and more problems in girls than the boys. So, and also there was Parvati ma'am from TPU hotline. She was saying that there are so many cases from the adolescents nowadays, and we should also focus especially out of school going adolescents. And Bivav Acharya, a psychiatrist from the USC, said understanding explanatory model will be more helpful, and which problem area the person brings in, that tells which group of adolescents would get more benefit. For example, those with interpersonal deficit might be helpful for the younger adolescents than the older adolescents. So yes, thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so just moving on to my group. Our discussion was based on the kind of adolescents that might benefit from the IPT, and then we talked about like someone who has who could have depression or can have anxiety, they could benefit more. And then also in more general, someone who has, let's say, behavioral issues or like kind of attachment problem or family conflict, and then also in terms of suicide as well, they could help with the IPT. And then what the group members also raised was, in cases of, let's say, more severe mental health problems like psychosis, or in terms of substance abuse, substance use, it might not be as helpful. So that was the general idea that we brought out from the group up in there. And also another thing that we pointed out was also in terms of like, how do we deliver these sessions? So if we are just taking people or school children who have some kind of baseline depression, anxiety, for example, then that could also lead to like stigmatization within that group. So that's that's the core of what we talk about. Oh, and then one last thing was also it could be as a treatment therapy, as well as it could be a preventive therapy as well. So like delivering it to the whole group of students who does not have, but taking adolescents as a vulnerable group, that's also something that could work with the IPT. So that's all from our group. So Katie, I'll just let you take over on your group, and then you can continue with your rest of the presentation.
Sure. We had a wonderful discussion in our breakout room. The answer to the question, will IPT work in all schools, was very definitely no, but there are things that we can do to change the school to optimize IPT's effects. So some of the suggestions that we had, so C2G was talking about the need to engage teachers, perhaps some psychoeducation with teachers, but also psychoeducation, importantly, with students. So on what is anger, what is grief, thinking about them becoming more, getting adolescents to become more emotionally literate, trying to reduce stigma in schools, which might prevent adolescents from wanting to participate in IPT by sharing stories and experiences, and providing adolescents with a safe space to share their worries within the schools. It was clear that it was going to be difficult to run IPT in schools. So Ruben was saying, where there's no foundation for talking or sharing, where there aren't counselors working, or there's a practice for adolescent sharing in general. And Gabi was very emphasized the need to customize IPT as per the need of the school, and actually beyond the school, thinking about the needs of the community at large. Brandon was talking too about leadership at the school. So if the leadership perceives IPT to be in competition with academic, the adolescent's academic schedule, that could be difficult, particularly if they don't create some space in the timetable for the sessions. And very much this central, so Nagendra was talking about focusing on the attitude of the teachers. So these are all really useful points that resonate with some of our thinking so far. Let me just share the summary slides, and then I'll let you go on with your evenings. So I'll present what we're thinking at the moment in relation to these two questions in the form of CMO hypotheses, context mechanism outcome hypotheses. So with regards to the first question, what kinds of adolescents would benefit? We are at the moment prioritizing this as a hypothesis that adolescents from higher socioeconomic backgrounds who are not experiencing structural vulnerability or adversity, intractable adversity, and who have more opportunities or flexibility to implement new strategies, that they'll be able to change their context in order to reduce conflict, build relationships, and improve their self-efficacy. And finally, that this will generate reductions in depression. So you could turn that on its head and talk about adolescents from poorer social backgrounds who have experience structural vulnerability and adversity, are less able to manipulate, change their environment. And therefore, what they're learning in IPT, they're less able to put that into practice. And therefore, the reductions that they might see in depression will be smaller than their wealthier peers or more privileged peers. We're also thinking about gender as an important factor. And we're trying to think a little bit about why boys might experience more benefit than girls. And I should say we can change these and refine these hypotheses as we go through the pilot trial. But for now, what we're thinking about is that boys who do not experience cultural norms or structural violence, which will have opportunities to implement new strategies. So we've actually sort of turned our findings on their head in a sense, and we're putting all of our eggs in the boys are going to do better than girls, boys are going to do better than girls basket, because they're able to be more to affect more change in their context than girls can. And then finally, thinking about age. So the idea with context mechanism outcome hypotheses is that you want to test things that are going to be useful for policymakers. And one thing that's useful to know is, do we give this intervention to class 8, 9, or do we give it to class 11 or something like that? And so we're also thinking about age, and the older adolescents might benefit more from IPT because they're cognitively more able. They also have more agency within their context to change their environment. And as a result of that, they're able to see greater improvements in depression than their younger colleagues. Will IPT work in all schools? Well, we're of the opinion, based on our formative research, that it's going to be better. We're going to have bigger effects in schools where there's a strong student staff and student relationships, mutual respect and social support. So you can call this a positive school climate. And luckily we have nice tools to measure this. And that in those schools, students will be able to affect more change their environments and put into practice what they're learning in IPT. And that this is going to give them greater improvements in depression than students who are doing IPT in schools with more negative environments. So that's all I'll say. Here's the team enjoying themselves before the hard work begins. The smiles are still on their faces. So thank you, Sujanji, for helping to run the breakout rooms. Watch this space, and we hope to come back and share our results with you all down the line. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Thanks for the wonderful presentation, and then participant for the discussion up in there. Before we leave, please make sure you fill up the feedback form. And then as a reminder, there will be no webinar for the next 2 months. So even though it's super early, happy Dasai and Tihar to every one of you. I hope you will enjoy the festival season in Nepal, and we'll see you in 2 months. Is it 2 or 3? 2 months, yeah. I'm bad with maths. All right, so thanks everyone. Enjoy the evening. So we'll see you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Sujan. Thank you, Soharda. Bye-bye.